Hello, it's just David here with my weekly video. We're just finishing our 10 questions. We've asked 10 questions and tried to sort of give, if not answers, a reasonable discussion of them from a Christian point of view, but also incorporating sort of other points of view that people might have. The idea being that those 10 questions aren't specifically perhaps where, religious people might start, but the sort of thing that, the person on the Clapham omnibus, the average person on the street, might want to address to us. I think it's gone okay. I mean, I would say that because I've written it, and maybe the questions have been slightly different. I don't know. But anyway, we've done our best. I say it seemed to go okay, and I think there's a couple of things about it that are both a challenge to us and then perhaps also a challenge to the world. I mean, first of all, there is a feeling that religion can be a bit preachy, that that it's a kind of slightly one way, preaching. If we think that proclamation and preaching, which is what particularly in the sort of Protestant churches we often talk about as being the talk of the church, that if you proclaim something or you're preaching about it, it's a rather one-way process. You're not terribly listening to the people. You're not really hearing. You're not listening to their questions in particular. Not actually hearing that perhaps if they profoundly disagree, maybe they've got something to say to you. And so this is an attempt to be a bit of a two-way conversation, and to listen to what the world is saying as well. Now, obviously, I'm not sure I've done it quite right because, in a sense, obviously, I'm on one side. But yeah, I think it was a good exercise. And as I say, very often, I mean, it was supposed to be also slightly as a confirmation course, and but very often, if you look at confirmation course, they kind of assume that it's a bit like a kind of curriculum where you're introducing people perhaps to a subject they don't know much about, and so you've got to give them a sort of fair amount of stuff before they can start asking questions. But this was trying to do the opposite. It was trying to start with the questions that people might just ask anyway, and seeing then if we could I say not necessarily answer them, actually listen to perhaps what they have to say and listen to a variety of opinions when it came to things like why do good people suffer? I mean, not just to give the Christian answer, but to say, well, here's a few answers that people might give, and they may be more or less acceptable to Christians, to come at it that way, if you like, to say not only what are the questions the world gives, but also what answers to the world give. And sometimes are those answers telling the church something. We shouldn't sort of rule that out. And of course, I mean, one of the things is that one particularly in church has to try and avoid kind of technical language. I mean, if you immediately start talking about Jesus as the expiation or propitiation for our sins, you're immediately talking a language that nobody ever uses in common day speech, and so unless you explain, they've got no idea what you're talking about, and trying to sort of avoid that as well. And I also wonder whether, however, strange enough, there are also the questions that people coming to church sometimes expect us to answer, or not answer, give a view on, or expect us to be talking about, and then they find us talking about something completely different. So I mean, I'm thinking, without being sort of too sort of controversial, that we might be talking about practical things, or the minutiae of worship, or how to keep things going, or we're talking about finances or whatever, and or the building or whatever, all of which are important. I don't knock them, but they kind of need to be in proportion, really, to other things we're talking about. I mean, you could have a church that's just brilliantly financed and ran lots of really enjoyable activities and had a lovely building, but nobody ever really learnt much about God, because questions about God weren't being asked or being answered. Now, I know it sounds slightly unlikely, slightly extreme, but I think the question is when people come to church, perhaps, or come to something to do with the church, is there a place and a time for them to A, ask questions, and B, expect to find some answers. So I hope that's been a sort of reasonably interesting exercise to do. As I say, obviously it's not perfect, but maybe something we think about in the future. Just that seed of how do we talk to a world and with a world, and without being preachy, and without complicating things, but in their terms, trying to understand what's being asked and trying to provide some solutions as well. And I think and also sometimes to realize that our answers aren't terribly good, and to think A, maybe the world has better answers, or B, we need to sharpen up our answers or re-examine them. And that's often been the thing the church has done. I should say, however, having said all of that, I do think that we ought to be honest that sometimes the church is sometimes the world is asking the wrong questions. The world can deflect itself from the important stuff. If the news is all celebrity gossip and we're not sort of answering questions about third world debt or justice or something, then I think we've got to say to the world, actually, you're asking the wrong questions. Or more, perhaps, like there really is. You are concerned with the wrong things. It may be that everybody, as I say, is absolutely fascinated by a bit of celebrity gossip, and we might want to unpack exactly what's going on in that, and why that's happening, and what kind of need it's fulfilling in people. That's kind of interesting in itself. But I think we also have to say, there probably are more important things in the world, and there probably are different questions to ask. And actually, sometimes if the church is asking those sort of more difficult, bigger questions, then it must, do so unapologetically. Now, I know, celebrity gossip is a kind of obvious thing to have a go at, but I think, the church, in a sense, can't sort of stop putting certain questions front and center. I think we've got to keep asking about justice. I think, if the world doesn't want to know about justice, tough in a sense, God does, and we've got to talk about it. And in that sense, we have got to, sometimes, I suppose, be in that sense a bit preachy to the world. And I think also, I think something I know from my sort of background in science, particularly, is the way that we ask questions, the way the world asks questions, often to sort of unpick the assumptions that are in questions and think what they might be. Sometimes before we rush into an answer, the sort of the classic policeman question of when did you stop beating your wife? That's rather obvious in there. There is rather a big assumption which is looming. A couple of assumptions actually that are looming, and sometimes you need to sort of say, well, hang on a minute before I answer this question. Just let's unpick some of those. And I think the world does ask a lot of questions sometimes, and Christians ask a lot, and sometimes when you just say just hang on, what assumptions do before I answer it, because you can get yourself into trouble. What sort of assumptions have you built into that question? People say to me sometimes, why is the world so much worse than it was, or why is this generation so much more X, Y, or Z than past generations? And actually, you want to say, well, hang on a minute, what's your truth? What's your proof those things are true? Before I even begin to think about the why question. So I hope, as I say, we come to the end of that. I've been trying to sort of answer some of those questions in the videos. that I've given over the past weeks. But as I say, I hope it's a twofold thing, really, is for the church to respond to the questions, the profound questions that the world is asking, and to also listen to its answers as well, particularly where they're a challenge to faith. But then also to to fire back some questions at the world. I don't think we should, if it's a proper two-way process, we shouldn't be afraid to do that, and to keep asking some questions that we want to ask and some issues that we want to keep at the top of the agenda. And I think, yeah, most importantly, how we learn to talk, to have, not just church and the world, but generally, how do we have discourse? How do we have honest questions? How do we talk to one another? How do we, so much of political and public debate at the moment seems to be really quite polarized and difficult, and two sides giving obviously kind of ridiculous and unnuanced answers. How do we look at issues in a reasonable sort of round table way, looking at it all from all sides, and be reasonable about how we discuss things? That's the sort of thing I want to aim for. I say I'm not sure we quite achieve it, but yeah, I think that's really important, not just the questions we ask, but how we go about discussing them. And I think, again, that maybe that's something we're not doing terribly well in today's world, or indeed in today's church. Anyway, there we are. As I say, I think the main thing is to carry on learning to talk and to discuss and to think together for the common good. Thank you.